morning, everyone. Our reading comes today from Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, starting from verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priesthood. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good question, isn't it? What's the Sabbath to do with today? And we've all heard of countries around the world, haven't we? Possibly even our own with ASIO, who have the secret police, who have spy agencies. And for the average citizen, these are scary organisations, maybe even dangerous. If you're a bit loud as a citizen, or your critique of the powers to be is a bit over the top, or if you exercise your freedom to overtly giving criticism of the governing powers, you could be in very serious trouble. There are spying eyes everywhere. Now, when it comes to the Pharisees, many of us think that they were the Jewish secret police. But that's a bit misleading. The Pharisees were really just a loose organisation, unofficial in every capacity, but they were very committed to the religious and the political sphere, and they've been around for more than 100 years before Jesus came along. They had no real authority, they weren't elected or chosen, they were a loose, but they did have quite a strong presence in most towns, in most villages, and particularly in the bigger places such as Jerusalem. So they were a very influential group, even if they weren't an official group. The Pharisees saw themselves as God's renewal movement, attempting to bring all Israel by getting each person, each family, each village to observe the Torah, the Old Testament law. And they explained the Old Testament law through their traditions, which had arisen over the last 100 years or so, which for them were explanations of the law. If this happened, if they could get a general great big movement of renewal in Israel, then the God would come and bless and renew the whole nation. So they acted as guardians of the Torah, or guardians of public morality. And they watched out in case there were breaches along the way of the people. That's what seems to be going on in Mark chapter 2. See, normally the Pharisees wouldn't have been too concerned if a few townsfolk had walked through a field of grain and eaten a few grains along the way. But you see, Jesus' group weren't ordinary by any stretch of the imagination. Jesus had been doing extraordinary things. He'd been teaching with great authority. He had attracted huge crowds to hear him teach and to heal. His star was growing brighter every day, and in a consequence, their star was fading into the background. So the question for them was, is he kosher or not? Will he abide by our traditions? Or will he be a radical? And so, in some ways, they decided that Jesus needed close watching. Thus the spying and the questions that kept coming to Jesus. And high on the list of questions for the Pharisees was the Sabbath. That is the fourth of the 10 Commandments. So it's important that we know what the Sabbath was about. So firstly, the Sabbath was about creation and rest. If you go back to the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 2, God finished his creation work at the end of the 6th day, and it says he rested on the 7th in verse 2. And then in verse 3 it says, God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. The word holy means that it's set apart. It's different. It's special. This is elaborated a little bit for us in the Exodus version of the Ten Commandments, where it says in verse 9, 6 days you shall work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath rest to the Lord. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but he rested on the 7th day. You'll note that the 7th day here is the 7th day of the week, which is a Saturday in our calendar. It is not the Sunday. God set aside the 7th day of each week for rest from work, so that the people of God might enjoy him, enjoy the goodness of his creation, and be refreshed. But it wasn't just, of course, for people, it was for the land. And every 40th year, 49th year, it was a Jubilee year. So there were 7ths and 7ths and 7ths for the land, for the people, and for the whole of creation. But there's another idea here within the Sabbath, that is the rescue out of Israel. And in Deuteronomy 15, verse 15, the 7th day is a day of rest where the people are called upon to remind themselves of their rescue from slavery in Egypt. We call that the Exodus. And so we read, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord brought you out of there with a mighty hand. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. It's interesting, isn't it? That it wasn't only a day of creation rest, it was a day in which you would remember that you had been slaves. And so you would thank God for that. So these two ideas are interwoven in the whole idea of the Sabbath. But later on, that's early on in Israel's history, a little bit later on in the time of the great prophets such as Isaiah, we read that this gave people the opportunity to exercise justice and compassion for the vulnerable and give away the idea of being self-centred. That was key to the parts of the prophets. But what the Sabbath was a call to compassion and justice on behalf of the vulnerable others, rather than being selfish when you observe it. And so, for example, in Isaiah 58, it links the Sabbath with compassion and social justice in the service of God, culminating with a description of God's blessing on those who call the Sabbath a delight. Isn't that nice? And you will find your joy in the Lord. Call the Sabbath a delight. Exercise the Sabbath by remembering the Exodus. Be a person who is committed to compassion and justice. These are the ideas rolling around with the Sabbath. After all, the Sabbath itself is to remember God's justice and God's righteousness in bringing the people out of slavery. Now, if we come back down all the centuries from Isaiah to Jesus' day, Sabbath observation had taken on another key important element. It was a badge of Jewish identity in a pagan world. For devout Jews, wherever they went, whether it was in Galilee or Samaria or Judea or abroad in the wider world, and many Jews lived in Rome and in modern-day Turkey and those sort of areas, all around the Mediterranean basin, all the way down into Afghanistan. There was Jews throughout the world. They were known for their Sabbath observation. To the great amusement of their pagan neighbours, Jews worked hard for 6 days, and then it was tools down. On the Friday night, that was it. As soon as sunset came along, they stopped all work for a whole day. Tools down, business doors closed, every Saturday. Thus, the Sabbath observation for the Jewish people was something that God had given them, which was good for them. It was a day of rest, a day of reflection and worship. But it also called upon them to be aware of justice and compassion for their neighbours. It pointed back to the Exodus, but it also pointed forward to the new creation when there would be eternal rest, when there would be peace, shalom, as they called it in the Old Testament, and true justice would reign. So what about the Pharisees and the Sabbath? Why did they have such run-ins with Jesus? Well, for the Pharisees, the Sabbath law was not very clear. If you read the verses that I just read to you, what does work mean, for instance? What is considered work? And so they had all these difficult problems. What could you do on the Sabbath day and what couldn't you do? And so they decided that over the years, those rules weren't clear enough because they didn't tell you what you could and couldn't do on a Sabbath. And so to clarify this, the Pharisees had developed a tradition of 613 little, what we call mini rules, that went along to explain what work was and what work wasn't. They tried to cover every area of life so that when you walked out of work at the end of the Friday, the sixth day, and walked into your home, you knew exactly what you could and couldn't do for the next 24 hours. But did Jesus agree with their 613 rules? Not at all. He saw things very differently. And so in Mark chapter 2, the clash takes place between Jesus and the Pharisees. It's not over whether to observe the Sabbath. Jesus did that regularly. He went to synagogues and so forth. He was a good Jew in that he went with his family, if you remember, down to Jerusalem for Passover and other sort of things. It wasn't about observing the Sabbath, it was how to observe it. For the Pharisees, Sabbath was primarily defined in negative terms. You shall not do this. You can't walk more than 1 kilometre from your home. You can't do this and you can't do that. You can't carry water or you can't lift your animal. But you can, if your cow falls down a ditch, you can get them out. Things like that, you know. They had little rules for every possible aspect of life. What Jesus and his disciples had been doing was walking through a wheat field, and they'd been just a little bit of, you know, a snack for morning tea. They'd grabbed a few wheat grains, rubbed them in their hands, and had a few sort of nibbles on some wheat kernels along the way. And nothing particularly obnoxious about that. But for the Pharisees, of course, plucking the ears was harvesting, and rubbing your hands was work. So they go to Jesus with this complaint. Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath traditional rules. So they accuse Jesus and his disciples of deliberately provoking the Sabbath laws as they saw them. Jesus, in his response, is very blunt. He points to an incident in the life of King David. Way back in 1,000 years earlier, King David and his men were desperately hungry. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 21, if you want to read about it. And they were on the run and illegally went into God's holy tent and ate the only food that they could find, which was the consecrated bread that was there on the altar. It was set aside for the high priest and his family to use. You can read about that law in Leviticus chapter 24. So Jesus cites this incident as an example of how rules, even God-given ones, are not intended to take precedent over special human need. God made the laws, but he made them to help us, not to rule over us. As verse 27 says, the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. So in wartime, if a Nazi knocked at your door and asked you if you were harbouring any Jews in your house, in the attic for instance, and you were, what would you say? I believe to save a life, you would tell a lie. You would say no. There are no there are no Jews in my house. And I believe that God would honour that in good conscience. So, like the anointed King David could do what he would normally not do, And while the anointed Messiah, Jesus, could walk through a wheat field and harvest some and have a snack with it, that was perfectly legitimate as far as Jesus was concerned. Jesus' new movement was a sign of new creation. It was a sign of justice and compassion and love. In him and his followers, God's new order was at hand, and the old order was suspended or superseded. And so what about today? What's the Sabbath for today? For many of us today, the Sabbath is a thing of the past. It's for the Jews. Okay? But some Christians have tried to turn our Sabbath our Sunday into a Sabbath. Let me tell you a story. When I was a young pastor, just out of theological college, I was at a church as the young families pastor and youth pastor, and I formed an indoor cricket team for the church. We had a great time. We played our games on Thursday or Friday evenings, and it was great because we had 2 or 3 players in the team that were from outside the church, and we were able to witness to them. All good. One year, however, our team was good enough to make the grand final, and due to a mix-up in the scheduling, it had to be played on a Sunday afternoon. Ho ho ho, we won! And I proudly brought the team and our trophies to the service that evening, rejoicing in our win. The next day, a retired pastor came and saw me. And he said to me, tore sheds into me. He said, "You're promoting playing sport on the Sabbath day." He truly believed it was a moral failure of mine and a very bad witness to the congregation. Sabbath rules couldn't be broken as far as he was concerned, and in his new view, playing sport on a Sunday was a really big no, no, no. I was behaving so badly I should repent, and I should never repeat it ever again. Have you grown up in a church like that, where people came to you and rules mattered more than people mattered? For me, that old pastor was a bit like a judgmental Pharisee of Jesus' day. I didn't play sport on a Sunday regularly. I hadn't chosen that. It was just a one-off. But for him, unlike our friend down here, retired John Martin, he's nothing like that. Sadly, we have many ex-church people out there in the community who have suffered at the hands of church Pharisees. And many have left the church completely disenchanted and deeply hurt. Being a Pharisee is not a good thing. Yes, I'm truly committed to church procedures. I'm deeply committed to church policies. I'm deeply the idea of having a code of ethics for us as ministers and for church leaders, church counsellors. I think that those really do matter. But they are meant to lift our humanity. They are meant to be for the enhancement of the church, not to crush our humanity or the life of the church. Please beware. When Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, he meant what this story was about in Mark chapter 2. In his movement, the new age had broken into the old age, and with it comes the fulfilment of the law. As the Apostle Paul says in Galatians and in other places, the law was in place as a teacher or guardian until the coming of the Messiah. And as verse 27 says plainly, Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath and can interpret the rules of the Sabbath with fairness and compassion and justice. Also, as Christians, our day of worship, reflection and relaxation is usually the first day of the week. That's what the New Testament Christians celebrated. They celebrated on the first day. What did they celebrate? Jesus' resurrection. And so we come together as a church on the Sunday, the first day of the week, to celebrate Jesus' resurrection. It is not, and I'll say that again, it is not a Sabbath day. That we may want to include some ideas about the Sabbath and rest for our day is a really good thing. It's a good and healthy thing if you want to include that in your daily reflection and prayer and that sort of thing. Rest from regular work, worship and prayer, enjoyment of creation, eating with family and friends, seeking justice. These are good Sabbath ideals. So in a world that is filled with busy people, where electronic communication such as TVs and phones, the internet and Netflix and Foxtel and everything else, where these invade our every moment if we let them, where people are running ragged and neglecting God and His calling, we need the gift of rest in order to renew our love for Him, to be with our families, to be with our neighbours. I think there's really good and healthy things about the policies of the Sabbath. So it's good to set aside a regular time during the week from the normal activities that you have every day, I would encourage, where the Sabbath, says Jesus, was made for our good. It was made to enhance our humanity. But the Sabbath ideas are not rules in the New Covenant community. And because you exercise your way of understanding a day of rest, good on you. Just don't make it a must for me, because I might not agree. Okay? So no judging others who do things differently. In good conscience, we can all differ about the Sabbath. Finally then, to finish, in Jesus, God shows us the core of authentic human life is love. The person who loves, says the Apostle Paul, fulfills the law, including the Sabbath. Thus we could say that the very reason that law exists is to point us towards a life of love. Thus the 6 last commandments are expressions of what it means to love your neighbour. You know, you don't murder them, you don't steal from them, you don't lie to them, you don't commit adultery with them, you don't even covet their stuff. But the 4th commandment links loving God with loving neighbour. And I think that's a really important thing to do. So the 4th commandment, the Sabbath commandment, links the 6 back to worshipping God, and it looks forward to new creation rest as we remember God for all that He's done for us, particularly through His Son Jesus, who was the true Israelite. And so for us Christians, celebrating, rejoicing, worshipping and praising together on the Lord's Day is surely what God intends for us to do. Sunday, growing in our love for Him and each other with compassion and justice, warms the heart of God. Makes Him smile, if you like, and it should encourage our hearts. Let's go to it. Amen? Amen. We're going to pray for others now.